June 22, 1941, 4 in the morning. While most of Moscow slept, Joseph Stalin sat awake in his Kremlin office, chain-smoking cheap cigarettes and reviewing reports that would soon prove catastrophically wrong. Within hours, 3 million German soldiers would cross the Soviet border in the largest military invasion in human history. But Stalin, the man who controlled the fate of nearly 200 million people, refused to believe it. His daily routine had trained him to sleep late, work through the night, and trust no one. On the most critical morning of his life, that routine would nearly destroy the Soviet Union. For the next 4 years, Stalin's personal habits would shape every decision of the bloodiest conflict in human history. His paranoia determined which generals lived and which died. His insomnia dictated when battles were planned. His eating habits forced exhausted military commanders to endure marathon dinners while their soldiers starved at the front. To understand how the Soviet Union survived and ultimately triumphed in World War II, we must first understand the strange, brutal daily life of the man who controlled it all from behind closed doors. This is the story of how one man's routine became a nation's reality during its darkest hour. Stalin's relationship with time itself was fundamentally abnormal, and it began long before the war. By 1941, he had spent nearly 2 decades consolidating absolute power through a combination of political maneuvering, mass terror, and an almost superhuman capacity for work. But this work came at a price. Stalin had trained his body to operate on a schedule that reversed day and night, and he forced the entire Soviet government to adapt to his rhythms. Unlike Western leaders who rose with the sun, Stalin typically woke between 11 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon. This wasn't laziness. It was calculation. By sleeping through the morning, Stalin ensured that he remained fresh and alert during the late evening and night hours when, he believed, people's defenses were down and their true intentions revealed. He had learned this during his revolutionary years when secret meetings happened after dark and police raids came at dawn. Now, as absolute dictator, he had the power to make the entire government operate on his preferred schedule. The consequences of this were profound. Ministers, generals, and party officials had to remain available until 3 or 4 in the morning, never knowing when Stalin might summon them. They couldn't maintain normal family lives. They couldn't establish predictable work schedules. They existed in a state of permanent exhaustion and anxiety, which was exactly what Stalin wanted. Tired people made mistakes. Tired people revealed secrets. Tired people were easier to control. When Stalin finally rose from bed in the early afternoon, he followed a surprisingly modest morning routine. Despite his absolute power, he maintained the habits of his Georgian peasant upbringing in some respects. He bathed in cold water, believing it strengthened his constitution. He dressed simply, almost always in his military-style tunic and boots, though he never actually served in the military during World War I. This uniform became his signature, a costume that projected strength and martial authority without the legitimacy of actual combat experience. His personal quarters in the Kremlin were surprisingly sparse. While other dictators surrounded themselves with luxury, Stalin kept his private rooms almost monastic. A narrow bed with coarse blankets, a simple desk covered in papers. Bookshelves lined with volumes he actually read, ranging from Russian classics to Marxist theory to military history. He prided himself on being an intellectual, and unlike Hitler, who relied primarily on his intuition, Stalin genuinely studied warfare, economics, and political philosophy, often staying up until dawn, reading and annotating books and documents. But there was nothing simple about his paranoia. Even in his private rooms, Stalin trusted no one completely. His food was prepared by a dedicated staff who lived in isolation and whose families were held as implicit hostages to their loyalty. Every item Stalin touched was tested for poison. His clothes were examined before he wore them. His bed sheets were changed daily and inspected for contaminants. This wasn't mere eccentricity. Stalin had ordered the assassination of so many people that he lived in perpetual fear of suffering the same fate. After his late rising and simple preparations, Stalin's actual workday began around 3 or 4 in the afternoon. This is when the machine of Soviet power truly started moving. Documents that had accumulated during the morning hours were brought to him in carefully organized stacks. Stalin read everything. Unlike leaders who relied on summaries, he insisted on seeing original reports, intelligence assessments, production figures, and military dispatches. He marked them up with his distinctive blue pencil, adding comments, questions, and sometimes threats in the margins. His office in the Kremlin became the beating heart of Soviet power. It was a large room with high ceilings, dominated by a massive desk that Stalin positioned so his back was always to the wall. He could see everyone who entered, but visitors couldn't easily see what was on his desk. Maps covered the walls, with pins marking Soviet forces, enemy positions, and industrial centers. As the war progressed, these maps became Stalin's obsession, and he could recall from memory the positions of divisions and the production capacity of factories across thousands of miles. The rhythm of his evening work sessions was methodical. Stalin divided his attention between military operations, industrial production, and political control. He understood, better than perhaps any other wartime leader, that modern warfare was as much about steel mills and coal mines as it was about tanks and artillery. While Churchill focused primarily on military strategy and Roosevelt on grand political visions, Stalin immersed himself in the minutiae of production quotas, railway schedules, and resource allocation. But this attention to detail came with a terrifying cost. Stalin's management style relied on fear. Factory managers who failed to meet quotas could be shot as saboteurs. Generals who retreated without explicit permission faced execution. Even successful commanders were never safe from his suspicion. Stalin had systematically purged the Red Army's officer corps in the late 1930s, executing tens of thousands of experienced military leaders because he feared they might threaten his power. When the war began, this left the Soviet military desperately short of competent leadership, a deficit that would cost millions of Soviet lives. The daily military briefings became a defining ritual of Stalin's wartime routine. Every evening around 7 or 8 o'clock, senior military commanders would arrive at the Kremlin to report on the situation at the front. These weren't collaborative strategy sessions. They were interrogations. Stalin would question generals relentlessly, probing for any sign of weakness, incompetence, or disloyalty. He had a remarkable memory for details and would catch commanders in even small inconsistencies between their current reports and previous statements. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who would emerge as the Soviet Union's most successful military commander, later recalled the psychological torture of these evening briefings. Stalin would sit at his desk, slowly filling his pipe with tobacco while commanders stood before him. The silence as he packed and lit the pipe was agonizing. Everyone knew that Stalin's mood could shift in an instant from apparent calm to volcanic rage. A general who entered the office expecting praise might leave under arrest. The fear was palpable and intentional. What made these sessions even more surreal was Stalin's habit of constantly moving around the room during important discussions. He couldn't sit still for long periods. He would pace behind his desk, then walk to the windows, then circle back to examine maps on the walls. All the while, he smoked continuously, filling the room with thick tobacco smoke that made some visitors physically ill, but which no one dared complain about. This physical restlessness contrasted sharply with his otherwise controlled demeanor, suggesting the enormous psychological pressure he operated under, even if he rarely showed it openly. After the military briefings concluded, usually around 10 or 11 at night, Stalin's routine took a turn that would seem bizarre to modern observers. This was when the real work of the Soviet government began. Ministers and party officials who had been waiting for hours would finally be summoned. Stalin would conduct meetings on economic policy, political appointments, intelligence reports, and countless other matters of state. These sessions could last until 2 or 3 in the morning, with exhausted officials struggling to stay alert, while Stalin, freshly rested from his afternoon wake-up, remained sharp and demanding. But the most dreaded part of Stalin's daily routine wasn't the work meetings. It was the dinners. Almost every night during the war, Stalin would host lengthy banquets in his Kremlin quarters or at his dacha outside Moscow. These weren't pleasant social gatherings. They were tests of loyalty and endurance disguised as hospitality. Members of the Politburo, senior military commanders, and foreign dignitaries would be compelled to attend these marathon meals that could stretch past 4 in the morning. The dinners followed a predictable but oppressive pattern. Heavy Georgian cuisine was served in overwhelming quantities. Wine and vodka flowed freely, with Stalin frequently proposing toasts that everyone was expected to enthusiastically join. But Stalin himself drank cautiously, often secretly replacing his vodka with water or wine with juice. He remained sober while encouraging others to drink heavily, watching how alcohol loosened their tongues and revealed their true thoughts. These dinners served multiple purposes in Stalin's mind. They allowed him to observe his subordinates in an informal setting, watching for signs of doubt, disagreement, or conspiracy. They reinforced his dominance by forcing powerful men to waste hours in his presence when they desperately needed sleep. And they satisfied some deep psychological need for companionship, even if that companionship was based entirely on fear rather than genuine affection or respect. Nikita Khrushchev, who would later succeed Stalin, described these dinners as a form of torture. Guests were expected to be entertaining and politically astute, while simultaneously avoiding any statement that could be interpreted as critical or disloyal. Stalin would tell crude jokes and expect laughter. He would make provocative statements to gauge reactions. Sometimes he would pit guests against each other, encouraging them to criticize colleagues who weren't present. The psychological games were constant and exhausting. The menu at these dinners reflected Stalin's Georgian heritage, but also his contradictory nature. He preferred simple, traditional dishes like khachapuri, a cheese-filled bread, and khinkali, meat-filled dumplings. Yet the portions were enormous and the variety overwhelming, a display of abundance in a nation where millions were starving. Stalin would eat moderately himself, but he insisted that guests consume large quantities, sometimes personally serving food onto their plates, in a gesture that was simultaneously hospitable and threatening. During the darkest days of the war, when German armies surrounded Leningrad and approached Moscow, these dinners took on an even more surreal quality. While Soviet soldiers died by the thousands daily, while civilians starved and froze, Stalin's inner circle gathered in well-heated rooms to consume feasts that would feed dozens of ordinary families. The moral disconnection was staggering, yet no one dared comment on it. To do so would be to question Stalin's priorities, which was tantamount to suicide. The dinners typically didn't end until Stalin himself decided to retire, usually between 3 and 5 in the morning. Only then could his exhausted guests finally leave, knowing they would need to be available again later the same day, with perhaps only a few hours of sleep before their own work responsibilities resumed. This sleep deprivation was policy, not accident. Stalin had learned that chronically exhausted subordinates were less likely to plot against him and more likely to make mistakes that he could then exploit to maintain his control. After his guests departed, Stalin would often continue working alone in his office. These solitary hours in the early morning darkness were when he made some of his most important decisions. Without the pressure of observers or the need to maintain his public persona, Stalin could think through complex problems, read intelligence reports more carefully, and plan his next moves. The loneliness of absolute power seemed to suit him during these hours when Moscow slept, and he alone remained alert, the spider at the center of a vast and deadly web. His insomnia wasn't just a personal quirk, it was a product of his psychology, and his circumstances. Stalin had spent decades in a state of permanent vigilance, first as a revolutionary evading the Tsar's secret police, then as a ruthless politician eliminating rivals, and finally as an absolute dictator maintaining power through terror. He had trained himself never to be vulnerable, and sleep was the ultimate vulnerability. Even in his own bedroom, with guards posted outside and food tasters protecting his meals, Stalin struggled to truly rest. The German invasion in June 1941 shattered even Stalin's carefully controlled routine. For the first few days after the attack began, he appeared to suffer something close to a nervous breakdown. The man who prided himself on controlling everything had been catastrophically surprised. Despite numerous intelligence warnings, he had convinced himself that Hitler wouldn't attack, at least not yet. His ego and his routine had blinded him to reality. During those first chaotic days, Stalin's daily schedule collapsed entirely. He retreated to his dacha outside Moscow and remained there for several days, barely communicating with his government. The Soviet military command structure, so dependent on his personal direction, nearly paralyzed. Generals didn't know if they had authority to make critical decisions. Some later accounts suggest Stalin feared he would be arrested or overthrown, that his decades of creating enemies had finally caught up with him in the moment of greatest crisis. But Stalin recovered, and when he returned to the Kremlin, his routine reasserted itself with renewed intensity. If anything, the shock of the invasion made him even more controlling, even more suspicious, and even more demanding of those around him. The difference was that now his decisions carried immediate life-or-death consequences for millions of people. A general summoned to Stalin's office for a midnight meeting might be ordering an offensive by dawn that would result in tens of thousands of casualties within days. The question of Stalin's health during the war years adds another layer to understanding his daily routine. He was in his early 60s when the war began, not young by the standards of the time, and he had spent decades under enormous stress. He suffered from recurring bouts of ill health, including severe headaches, arthritis, and possibly heart problems. Yet he refused to show weakness or significantly alter his punishing schedule. His physicians walked a dangerous tightrope. They needed to keep Stalin functional, but couldn't suggest that he was seriously ill or vulnerable. To do so might make them appear to be predicting or hoping for his death, which could be interpreted as treason. So Stalin's doctors provided treatments for his various ailments while being careful never to diagnose anything that sounded life-threatening. They recommended rest that Stalin ignored. They suggested diet changes that Stalin refused. They existed in constant fear that if Stalin died under their care, they would be blamed and executed. Stalin's use of the underground bunker system beneath Moscow reveals another dimension of his wartime routine. As German forces approached the capital in late 1941, Stalin moved his headquarters to a reinforced bunker complex deep beneath the Kremlin. This wasn't cowardice. Stalin remained in Moscow when much of the government was evacuated, a decision that helped stabilize morale. But the bunker became his primary workspace during the most critical months of the war. The bunker environment intensified Stalin's already nocturnal habits. Deep underground, with artificial lighting and sealed from the outside world, day and night became even more meaningless. Stalin's routine became almost submarine-like, operating on his own internal clock with no reference to the sun's position. The bunker contained meeting rooms, sleeping quarters, communication centers, and even a small dining area where those dreaded late-night banquets continued despite the proximity of German armies. Living and working in the bunker took a psychological toll that Stalin never publicly acknowledged. The air was recycled and stale. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the hum of ventilation systems and the clatter of typewriters. Stalin's claustrophobia, if he had any, had to be suppressed. This was the reality of total war at the highest level, a bizarre existence where one made decisions affecting millions while isolated in a concrete tomb beneath the earth. Security protocols in and around Stalin's daily movements reached absurd extremes. Multiple guards surrounded him at all times, with redundant layers of security checking and rechecking everyone who came near him. His route between the Kremlin and his dacha varied constantly to prevent potential assassins from predicting his movements. Food tasters sampled everything before it reached his plate. Even the paper and documents he read was tested for poison. This paranoia extended to technology. Stalin was deeply suspicious of telephones, believing they could be intercepted or used to eavesdrop. He preferred written communications or face-to-face meetings, which contributed to the exhausting routine of constant late-night gatherings. When he did use the telephone to communicate with field commanders, the conversations were typically brief and cryptic, with Stalin assuming enemies were listening. This technological paranoia sometimes hindered effective command and control during critical military operations. The winter of 1941 and 1942 marked the lowest point of Stalin's wartime experience. German forces had captured vast territories, killed or captured millions of Soviet soldiers, and reached the outskirts of Moscow. Yet Stalin's routine remained remarkably consistent. He continued his late rising, his evening briefings, his midnight work sessions, and his pre-dawn banquets, even as the foundations of his regime seemed to be crumbling. This consistency was both his strength and his limitation. It provided stability and predictability to his government, but it also revealed a certain rigidity, an inability or unwillingness to adapt his personal habits even in the face of catastrophe. As Soviet forces gradually stabilized the front and then began pushing the Germans back, Stalin's confidence and authority reasserted themselves. The daily military briefings became less about desperate defense and more about planning offensives. Stalin began to involve himself more directly in operational planning, sometimes overruling his generals' recommendations. This had mixed results. His insistence on certain operations led to unnecessary casualties, while his political sense of timing helped coordinate military advances with diplomatic objectives. The relationship between Stalin's routine and his decision-making style became particularly evident during the planning of major operations. Stalin preferred to make important decisions late at night after lengthy discussions. He would summon his military advisors for marathon planning sessions that could last 10 or 12 hours. Maps would be spread across tables. Intelligence reports would be reviewed repeatedly. Generals would present plans which Stalin would question relentlessly, looking for weaknesses or hidden risks. These exhausting sessions reflected Stalin's deep-seated need to control everything personally. He couldn't delegate truly important decisions because he trusted no one enough to do so. This meant that as the war progressed and Soviet forces launched increasingly complex operations across thousands of miles of front, Stalin became the bottleneck through which all major decisions had to pass. His stamina was remarkable, but even he couldn't personally oversee everything, which led to delays and missed opportunities that more decentralized command structures might have exploited. Stalin's eating habits during the war years revealed the contradictions of his character. At his nightly banquets, he presided over abundance, while millions of Soviet citizens faced starvation. Yet in his private meals, when no one was watching, Stalin often ate simply: a bowl of soup, some bread, perhaps some fruit. He wasn't a glutton in the traditional sense. The elaborate dinners were political theater, displays of power and tests of loyalty, not expressions of personal hedonism. His relationship with alcohol followed a similar pattern. Stalin encouraged heavy drinking among his subordinates, but remained relatively sober himself. He had learned this technique during his revolutionary days when information could be extracted from drunk comrades. Now, as dictator, he used the same method on his ministers and generals. The moral implications seemed not to trouble him. Stalin viewed human relationships as fundamentally transactional and manipulative. Genuine friendship or trust were, in his worldview, dangerous illusions that weak people indulged in. The question of how much sleep Stalin actually needed or got during the war years is difficult to answer definitively. Various accounts suggest he typically slept only 4 to 6 hours per day, usually in the late morning and early afternoon. This chronic sleep deprivation might explain some of his more erratic decisions and volcanic temper. Modern research on sleep deprivation suggests that prolonged periods of insufficient rest impair judgment, increase paranoia, and reduce emotional regulation, all traits that Stalin displayed in abundance. Yet Stalin also had the dictator's privilege of napping when he chose. If he was particularly exhausted after a marathon work session, he could simply go to sleep in the early morning hours and not wake until mid-afternoon, delaying all government business until he chose to rise. No one could complain. No one could schedule anything without accounting for his unpredictable sleep schedule. In this way, Stalin's personal routine became a tool of control, keeping everyone around him off balance and anxious. The turning point of the war came at Stalingrad, and Stalin's personal investment in that battle reflected his routine's influence on strategic decisions. He had ordered that the city bearing his name must be held at all costs, a decision driven as much by ego as by military necessity. The daily reports from Stalingrad became an obsession during his evening briefings. He would trace the front lines on maps, questioning commanders about specific streets and buildings, sometimes making tactical decisions about battalion-level deployments that should have been left to officers on the ground. When the tide turned and Soviet forces surrounded the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad, Stalin's vindication seemed complete. His nightly briefings became more animated, even approaching something like satisfaction. Yet even in victory, his paranoia remained. Generals who had performed brilliantly were still summoned to explain their decisions. Commanders who had captured German officers were questioned about what intelligence they had revealed. Trust was not in Stalin's vocabulary, even after stunning victories. As the war progressed and Soviet forces began the long advance westward toward Germany, Stalin's routine adapted in subtle ways. The immediate crisis had passed, which allowed him to return to some peacetime patterns. His dinners became even longer and more elaborate, celebrating victories, but also reasserting his dominance over subordinates who might have gained too much prestige through military success. Stalin understood that successful generals could become political threats, and he used his nightly gatherings to remind them who truly held power. His reading habits during this period reveal his forward thinking. While still monitoring military operations closely, Stalin began focusing more on post-war planning, territorial arrangements, and political restructuring. He read extensively about Eastern European history and politics, preparing for the Soviet occupation and control of the region. His evening work sessions increasingly dealt with political rather than purely military matters, anticipating the Cold War that would follow the hot one. The conferences with Western allies at Tehran and Yalta required Stalin to temporarily adapt his routine to accommodate Churchill and Roosevelt's more conventional schedules. This caused him considerable irritation. Stalin preferred to negotiate late at night when he felt most alert and when he believed his opponents would be tired and vulnerable. Being forced to attend daytime meetings put him at a perceived disadvantage, though he managed to achieve most of his territorial and political objectives regardless. Observers at these international conferences noted Stalin's unusual habits with a mixture of curiosity and unease. He seemed to be operating on a different biological clock than everyone else, appearing most energetic and engaged during evening sessions when others were flagging. His insistence on lengthy dinners with heavy drinking troubled Western delegates who weren't accustomed to such marathon social events as part of serious diplomatic negotiations. Yet Stalin used these dinners skillfully, extracting commitments and gauging intentions, while his counterparts grew increasingly tired and intoxicated. By the final year of the war, as Soviet forces drove into Germany itself, Stalin's daily routine had become fully institutionalized as the normal operating procedure for the Soviet government. A generation of Soviet officials had learned to function on his schedule, and many had internalized his paranoid worldview. The system Stalin had built around his personal habits would outlast the war and continue in modified form long after his death. The question of Stalin's conscience during this period remains unanswerable, but intriguing. Did he ever wake in the night, unable to return to sleep, haunted by the millions who had died under his rule? Did he feel guilt for the generals he had executed before the war who might have prevented early disasters? Did the endless casualty reports that crossed his desk every evening affect him emotionally, or had he trained himself to view human lives as mere statistics in pursuit of victory? The historical record provides no clear answers. Stalin left no diary revealing his inner thoughts. His public statements were carefully crafted propaganda. Those who knew him best were either too frightened to speak honestly about him during his lifetime or had their own reasons to distort the truth after his death. What remains are his actions, his routines, and the system he created, all of which suggest a man who had deliberately suppressed normal human empathy in favor of ruthless pragmatism and an obsessive need for control. As the war drew to a close in the spring of 1945, Stalin's routine showed no signs of moderating. If anything, victory made him more, not less, demanding of his subordinates. The nightly briefings continued. The marathon dinners persisted. The late-night work sessions carried on without respite. Stalin had proven that his method, however brutal and however costly in human terms, had worked. The Soviet Union had survived and triumphed. The system built around his personal habits had delivered victory. But the cost of that victory was almost incomprehensible. Over 25 million Soviet citizens died during the war. Cities were reduced to rubble. The economy was shattered. An entire generation of young men had been killed or maimed. Whether a different leader with a different daily routine and management style could have achieved victory with fewer casualties is a question historians still debate. What's undeniable is that Stalin's personal habits, his paranoia, his insomnia, his need for control, all shaped how the war was fought and how many people died in the process. The daily routine of a leader might seem like a trivial detail compared to the grand sweep of history. But in Stalin's case, his personal habits became national policy. When he woke determined who could meet with him and when. His eating schedule determined when crucial military decisions were made. His paranoia determined which generals survived and which were executed. His insomnia kept an entire government awake and exhausted. One man's quirks and neuroses were amplified by absolute power into a system that defined how the largest country on earth fought the most destructive war in human history. Stalin's wartime routine reveals something fundamental about the nature of totalitarian power. In democracies, systems and institutions provide checks on individual leaders' peculiarities. A prime minister who insisted on sleeping all morning and working all night would face pressure from Parliament and the press to adapt to conventional schedules. But Stalin had eliminated all institutional constraints on his power. There was no Parliament to question him, no free press to criticize him, no independent judiciary to check his decisions. His personal routine became the state's routine because there was no mechanism to resist or modify it. This absolute power came with absolute isolation. Stalin's nightly banquets were populated with people who feared him, not friends who genuinely cared about his well-being. His work sessions involved subordinates who told him what they thought he wanted to hear rather than inconvenient truths. His reading, extensive though it was filtered through an ideology that confirmed his pre-existing beliefs. He had created around himself a perfect echo chamber where his own thoughts and preferences were constantly reflected back to him as universal wisdom. The Soviet victory in World War II was real and hard-won by the sacrifices of millions of ordinary soldiers and citizens. But it was achieved despite, not because of, Stalin's daily routine and management style. The Red Army succeeded because of the courage of its soldiers, the vastness of Soviet territory, the harshness of Russian winters, the productivity of Soviet industry, and the material support provided by Western allies. Stalin's contribution was to provide a certain brutal determination and to prevent the emergence of any alternative leadership that might have challenged the war effort. Whether this justified the system he created and maintained is a question each person must answer for themselves. The legacy of Stalin's wartime routine extended far beyond 1945. The habits and systems he established became the model for Soviet governance for decades. Future Soviet leaders inherited a government that operated on suspicious, secretive principles, where personal loyalty mattered more than competence, where fear motivated more effectively than inspiration, and where the leader's personal preferences took precedence over institutional norms. This system would eventually prove unsustainable, but it survived for another 45 years after Stalin's death, a testament to how deeply his personal habits had been embedded in the structure of Soviet power. For those 4 years of total war, one man's bizarre sleep schedule, his paranoid security precautions, his marathon dinners, and his need for absolute control became the operational framework for a nation of 200 million people locked in existential combat. It's a reminder that history is made not just by grand ideas and mass movements, but also by the personal quirks and daily habits of individuals who find themselves, through talent or ruthlessness or accident, in positions of absolute power. Stalin's routine was his own, but its consequences belonged to everyone who lived under his rule or fought against the regime he commanded. The sun rose and set over Moscow for 4 years of war. For most people, these astronomical events marked the rhythm of their days. But in the heart of the Kremlin, in offices lit by electric bulbs and warmed by central heating, a different rhythm prevailed. Stalin woke when others prepared for evening. He worked when others slept. He ate when others fasted. And through it all, he shaped the course of the most destructive war in human history according to a schedule that belonged to no natural cycle, only to the peculiar psychology of absolute power. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, hit like and subscribe for more untold stories from history. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.